Clara Whitmore pressed both palms flat on the kitchen table and looked every one of those 6 boys dead in the eye. Her dress was still dusty from the road. Her hands were trembling. And the man she had just married 3 hours ago was standing in the doorway, watching her like she was a problem he didn't know how to solve. The oldest boy, tall jaw set, hard arms crossed, leaned forward and said it plain. "You ain't our mother. You ain't ever gonna be. And come morning you'll be gone just like the rest." Clara didn't flinch. She pulled out the one chair left at the table, sat down slow and said, "Then I reckon you best get comfortable waiting, because I'm not going anywhere. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you never miss a single episode. Drop the name of your city down in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning and find out what kind of woman walks into a house full of grief and decides to stay. The stagecoach rolled into Red Hollow, Montana on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1887, and the town barely noticed. It was the kind of town that had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. Dust on the main road, a general store with a sagging front porch, a saloon that opened too early and closed too late, and people who watched strangers with the particular kind of suspicion that came from living hard lives in a hard place. But the woman who stepped off that coach was worth watching. She was 28 years old, slender in a way that spoke of skipped meals rather than privilege, with dark chestnut hair pinned back under a hat that had seen better days. Her dress was clean but worn thin at the elbows. She carried one suitcase, a single battered thing held together at the latch with a leather strap she had tied herself. In her other hand, folded and creased from being read too many times, was a letter. She stood on the platform for a long moment after the coach pulled away, and she read that letter one final time. She had already memorized every word. "I need someone who can help raise my boys. I have land. I have a home. But I cannot do this alone anymore. Nathaniel Carter." Clara Whitmore folded the letter back into thirds, tucked it into the front pocket of her dress, and picked up her suitcase. She had made her decision 3 weeks ago in a boarding house room in St. Joseph, Missouri, sitting on the edge of a bed she could no longer afford, with a termination notice from the school board in one hand and $22.30 in the other. She was not naive. She knew what this was. This was not a love story. This was a survival arrangement. She had answered the advertisement in the back pages of the Missouri Gazette, the one that read, "Widowed rancher, Red Hollow, Montana, seeks capable woman of good character to assist in raising 6 sons. Correspondence welcomed. Compensation room board and honest partnership." She had written back the same night. The reply came 11 days later, and now she was here. A man she had never met in person was supposed to be waiting for her somewhere near the livery stable on the north end of Main Street. The letter said he drove a gray wagon and had a black hat with a silver band. Clara walked the length of the main road without hurrying. She looked at the storefronts. She looked at the people who looked back at her with the flat curiosity of small-town folk who could spot an outsider from 100 yards. A woman sitting outside the dressmaker's shop said something behind her hand to the woman beside her. 2 men leaning on a post in front of the hardware store watched Clara pass and said nothing, which somehow felt worse than if they had spoken. She found the gray wagon exactly where the letter said it would be. The man standing beside it was not what she expected. She had imagined someone older, worn down to the bone. A man hollowed out by years of grief and hard work, and a life that had taken more than it had given. Nathaniel Carter was 42 years old, tall and broad in the shoulders, with dark hair shot through with silver at the temples, and a face that had been handsome once and still carried the memory of it. His hands were calloused. His jaw was set in a way that suggested he had not smiled easily in a long time. He wore the black hat with the silver band exactly as the letter described. He saw her coming and straightened. Clara stopped in front of him and shifted her suitcase to her left hand and extended her right. "Mr. Carter," she said. "I'm Clara Whitmore." He looked at her hand for just a moment too long before he shook it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and careful. "I appreciate you coming." "Clara," she said. "You can call me Clara." He nodded once. "Nathaniel." Neither of them said anything else for a moment. She could tell he was assessing her the same way she was assessing him, looking for something he could trust. She didn't know if she was finding it. She didn't know if he was either. "Is your wagon nearby?" she asked. "You're standing beside it." She looked at the gray wagon, looked back at him, and nodded. "Right. Then I suppose we should go." He took her suitcase from her without asking, which she decided to take as manners rather than presumption, and set it in the back of the wagon. They drove out of Red Hollow in silence. Clara watched the town shrink behind them and turned to face the road ahead. The land opened up wide and flat, and then rolled into low hills covered in dry grass that caught the afternoon light and turned gold. It was beautiful in a hard, uncompromising way. A landscape that didn't apologize for itself. She liked it immediately. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. "About 6 miles north." "And your boys, are they expecting me today?" A pause. "I told them you were coming." "That's not the same thing." He glanced at her sideways. "No, I suppose it isn't." Another silence. Clara decided she would not fill every silence with talking. She had met people who did that, and it never served them well. She let the quiet sit between them and watched a hawk circle high overhead in the wide blue sky. "Thomas is the oldest," Nathaniel said after a while. "He's 21. He's been running the household since his mother passed. How long ago did she pass? 4 years. And the others? Samuel is 18. William is 15. He paused. "William's going to be difficult. Most 15-year-olds are." He didn't disagree with that. "Henry is 12. Joseph is 9. And Ethan." He stopped. "Ethan," she prompted. "He just turned 6. His voice changed on that name, got quieter. "He was 2 when their mother died. He doesn't remember her." Clara said nothing for a moment. She let that land where it needed to. "That's a heavy thing," she said finally. "Yes." Nathaniel's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "It is." The rest of the drive passed in pieces of conversation broken up by stretches of quiet. Clara asked about the ranch, about the land, about how long the Carters had been in Montana. Nathaniel answered each question with enough words to be truthful and not quite enough to be revealing. She could feel the wall he kept up. She understood it. She had one of her own. When the ranch came into view, she understood why the letter had sounded the way it did. Not because it looked hopeless, but because it looked like something that had been loved once and then lost track of itself. The main house was solid enough. 2 stories. Wood framed a wide front porch that had probably been a fine place to sit in the evenings once upon a time. But the railing on the left side had come away from its post, and nobody had fixed it. The front steps had a soft spot in the second one she could see from the wagon. The paint on the window frames had been peeling for long enough that the peeling itself had started to peel. The barn was large and functional, but the roof on the near corner had been patched with what looked like salvaged boards that didn't quite match. The fence line stretching out toward the north pasture had 3 broken posts in a row that had been left lying on their sides in the grass. It wasn't ruin. But it was a place where the repairs had stopped being made, where the daily business of keeping things together had slowly been replaced by the daily business of simply getting through. Nathaniel pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch, and Clara climbed down before he could come around to help her. She stood in the yard and looked at the house. 5 boys appeared on the front porch in the span of about 30 seconds, which told her they had been watching from the windows. They arranged themselves in a loose row without seeming to mean to. The tallest on the left, the others stepping down in height to the right like a staircase. 5 different faces, all watching her with the same expression underneath whatever surface expression each had chosen. A combination of wariness and something older. Something that had nothing to do with age. The oldest. Thomas had his arms crossed before she even reached the porch steps. He had his father's height and his mother's coloring, she supposed. Dark-eyed and sharp-featured with the bearing of a boy who had taken on a man's weight and grown into the shape of it, whether he wanted to or not. The one beside him, Samuel, she guessed by age, was watching her with a kind of careful neutrality, like a man at a card table who hadn't yet decided how to play his hand. William was easy to identify because he was the one who was not pretending to be calm. His jaw was set tight, and his eyes were direct in the way that teenage boys got when they had decided to be angry at something before it had the chance to hurt them. Henry stood slightly behind William, watching from between his older brother's shoulder and the porch post. He had a quiet face, the kind that listened more than it spoke. Joseph stood on Henry's other side, with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted slightly, studying her with a child's forthright curiosity. And at the far end of the porch, standing with one hand holding the post and his feet bare despite the fact that it was not warm, was a small boy with dark curls and wide, serious eyes that were far older than 6 years old had any right to be. Ethan. Clara looked at him, and something shifted in her chest. She walked up to the porch steps. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. She addressed all 5 of them, not just Thomas, even though Thomas was clearly the one who mattered here. "I'm going to be your father's wife. I know that's a strange thing. I imagine it feels strange to you. It feels strange to me, too." She paused. "I'm not here to pretend it doesn't." Nobody said anything. Thomas uncrossed his arms and recrossed them higher. "How long are you planning on staying?" "I'm planning on staying permanently," she said. "That's what the last one said." She kept her expression even. "There was someone before me. There were 2 someones before you." He said it flatly, not cruelly, though it came close. "First one lasted 11 days. Second one lasted 3 weeks. Both of them said they were planning on staying permanently." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her suitcase. "I'd like to see the kitchen," she said. "Can someone show me where it is?" Thomas blinked. He had expected her to argue or apologize or crumble. She could see the recalculation happening behind his eyes. Joseph said, "I'll show you," and pushed off the porch railing before anyone could stop him. She followed the 9-year-old into the house. The inside was cleaner than she expected and bleaker than she hoped. Someone, Thomas most likely, had kept the dust from accumulating and the floors from going unwashed. But it was a house maintained the way a barn was maintained, for function, not for comfort. The curtains were thin and uneven. The furniture was solid but cheerless. There were no flowers anywhere, no pictures on the walls in the hallway, nothing that suggested anyone had thought about making the space feel like anything other than a place to sleep and eat. Joseph walked her straight to the kitchen and stood in the doorway watching her as she set her suitcase down and looked around. The kitchen was the largest room she'd seen so far, with a good iron stove, a wide table, and enough counter space to work with. But the shelves were her first concern. She crossed to the pantry and opened the door. What she found made her be very still for a moment. 3 tins of dried beans, a partial sack of cornmeal, a small jar of lard that was nearly empty, some salt, a few dried herbs that had long since lost their color, a single potato that had started to go soft. She turned around. "Joseph," she said. "Yes'm." "What did you eat for supper last night?" He looked at the floor. "Cornmeal mush." "And the night before?" "Cornmeal mush," he said. Then quietly, "And before that?" She looked at the empty shelves for a moment longer. Then she asked the question she already knew the answer to. "Is Ethan always barefoot?" Joseph hesitated. "His boots got too small. Pa was gonna get new ones in town, but he's been busy." She nodded slowly. "Thank you for showing me the kitchen," she said. "You can go on." Joseph lingered in the doorway. "You're not gonna leave, are you?" he asked. His voice was carefully flat, the way children made their voices flat when they were asking about things that mattered too much. Clara looked at him. "No," she said. "I'm not." He nodded once, like he was filing that information away, in a place where he would keep it, but not count on it yet, and then he disappeared back into the hallway. Clara turned back to the shelves. She was still standing there thinking when she heard the soft scrape of small feet on the kitchen floor, and turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway. He had followed her inside without her noticing. He stood there with his bare feet and his serious eyes, and he wasn't saying anything. He was just looking at her with the particular attention of a child who had learned to watch adults very carefully. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said back. "Are you hungry?" He looked at the floor. He was 6 years old, and he was thinking about whether he was allowed to say yes to that question. She could see him turning it over. "It's all right," she said. "You can tell me." "Yes," he said. "Very small. I am." Clara turned back to the empty shelves. She took a breath. She found her apron in her suitcase, the one thing she had packed that wasn't strictly clothing, and she tied it on over her dress. She took stock of what she had. She thought about what she could make. She rolled her sleeves up to her elbows. "Ethan," she said, "can you do something for me?" He straightened up slightly. "Yes'm." "Go out back and see if there are any eggs in the hen house. Can you do that?" He was already moving toward the back door. She heard his bare feet on the porch steps outside. She had beans to soak cornmeal to work with and almost nothing else. But she had cooked for 23 students on a schoolteacher's budget, with less than this, and she was not the kind of woman who stood still in front of an empty shelf and called it impossible. She started a fire in the stove. She got the beans into water. She began to work. The sounds of the house shifted around her as the afternoon moved into evening. She could hear Nathaniel outside the creak of the barn doors, the low sound of his voice talking to the horses. She heard the older boys upstairs at some point, then on the porch, then somewhere out back. Nobody came into the kitchen. Ethan came back with 4 eggs cradled carefully in his shirt held out from his belly like an offering. "That's wonderful," she told him. "Set them right there." He set them down on the counter with the concentration of a child transporting something precious, and then he stayed. He sat on the low stool near the stove, and he watched her work, and she let him watch, and after a while, she started talking, not to fill the silence, but because he seemed like a boy who needed to hear a voice in a kitchen, and she was there, and she had one. She told him about Missouri, about the school where she had taught, about the creek behind her family's house when she was a girl that would freeze solid in the winter and they would walk across it. She talked about small things, ordinary things, and Ethan listened with complete attention, sitting with his bare feet tucked up under him on the stool. "Did you have brothers?" he asked at one point. "2," she said. "Both older." "Were they mean?" She smiled without looking up from what she was stirring. "Sometimes. Were yours mean to you?" He thought about it seriously. "Thomas isn't mean. He's just—" He searched for the word. "Tired." "That's a good way to put it," she said. "William is mean, but only when he's sad," Ethan said with the uncanny precision of a child who has been observing his family very carefully for his entire life. "Henry never talks much. Joseph talks too much. Samuel is—" Another pause. "Samuel thinks about leaving." Clara stopped stirring for just a moment. "Does he?" she said. "He has a map," Ethan said. "I saw it. He keeps it under his mattress." She started stirring again. By the time supper was ready, the kitchen smelled of something beans and cornbread, and the eggs scrambled soft with the last of the dried herbs. And it was not a grand meal by any measure, but it was warm, and it was present, and it was enough. She set the table. She put a plate at every seat, including one at the head of the table for Nathaniel. Then she stood in the kitchen doorway and called out toward the house, "Supper." Silence. She waited. Joseph appeared first, coming down the stairs 2 at a time. Then Henry slower with his hands in his pockets. Then Samuel, who paused in the hallway and looked at the set table with an expression she couldn't quite read before he came in and sat down. Nathaniel came in from outside, still in his work coat, and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen when he saw the table. He looked at Clara. "I told you," he said. "You don't need to." "I know you told me," she said. "Sit down." He sat. William came in last. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table, then at Clara, then at the food, and his expression said very clearly that he had decided not to want anything from her. He sat at the far end of the table. He ate every bite on his plate. He did not say thank you, and she did not expect him to. Ethan sat beside her at the table. No one had told him to. He had simply chosen the chair next to hers, and he ate with the quiet concentration of a child who had been hungry for longer than that one evening. Nobody talked much during supper, but they were all at the table, all of them. That alone felt like something. After supper, when the boys had scattered, and Nathaniel had gone back outside to finish the evening chores, Clara cleared the table and washed the dishes in the dark kitchen with only the lantern for light. She was almost done when Thomas appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, watching her. She could feel his eyes on her back, careful and measuring. "You want to know something?" he said. She kept washing. "I expect you're going to tell me. The first woman Pa brought here, woman from Billings, she lasted 11 days because William put a dead snake in her room." Clara set the dish in her hand down carefully and dried her hands on her apron. She turned around. Thomas looked at her steadily. His expression wasn't cruel. It was warning. "The second woman lasted 3 weeks," he continued. "She left because Henry stopped talking entirely, and it scared her." "Did he stop talking to scare her, or did he stop talking because he was scared himself?" Clara asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "Then that might be worth finding out." She turned back to the last of the dishes. "I appreciate the information, Thomas. I mean that." He stayed in the doorway a moment longer. "I'm not trying to run you off," he said. He sounded like he surprised himself saying it. "I know," she said. "I just—" He stopped, started again. "This family's been through enough." "I know that too," she said. "So you understand," he said, "that if you leave Thomas—" She turned around again. She looked at him directly. "I understand what happens if I leave. I'm not going to leave." He looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said at last. Not like he believed her, but like he had decided to let her prove it or not prove it on her own terms. He pushed off the door frame and walked away down the hall. Clara turned back to the last dish. Outside, the Montana sky had gone dark and enormous, and the stars had come out hard and bright, the way they did out here, away from any town's light, and the ranch sat quiet in the middle of all that space. She dried the last dish. She hung up her apron. She picked up the lantern and went upstairs to find the room Nathaniel had told her would be hers, plain and small, with a window facing east, so she would have morning light. She set the lantern on the windowsill and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked out at the darkness. She had known this would be hard. She had not quite understood yet what kind of hard. But she had also known something else. Something she had carried with her all the way from Missouri. Something that had kept her from turning back at the last possible moment in St. Joseph, when she had very nearly talked herself out of this entire thing. She had known what it was to be somewhere she did not belong. She had known what it was to feel like a person whose presence made no particular difference to the world. And she had decided firmly, finally, without drama, that she was not going to let that be the whole of her story. She lay down on the narrow bed in her clothes, too tired to change. She listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Ethan cough once in his sleep. She heard William's footsteps going past her door, deliberate a little loud, the walk of a boy who wanted her to know he was there and wasn't afraid of her. She heard Nathaniel come in downstairs, heard the slow sounds of the house getting ready for the night. And then everything went quiet. Clara stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would be the real beginning. Tonight was only arrival. She closed her eyes. She thought about the 6 eggs Ethan had carried in from the henhouse, like they were something precious. She thought about the way Joseph had asked his question. "You're not going to leave, are you?" with that careful flatness that children used when they were protecting themselves from hoping too much. She thought about Thomas standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, warning her away and asking her to stay in the same breath. She thought about the empty shelves in the pantry. Tomorrow, she would need to talk to Nathaniel about supplies. Tomorrow, she would need to figure out the range of what she was actually dealing with here. The finances, the animals, the land. Tomorrow, she would need to find a way to make William not hate her, or at least make him feel less like he had to. And tomorrow, she would find Ethan a pair of boots that fit. But that was tomorrow. Tonight she lay in the dark, and she breathed, and she let the house be strange around her, and she did not let herself feel afraid. She had come too far to be afraid. The Carter ranch settled into the deep quiet of a Montana night. And somewhere in the middle of all that silence, Clara Whitmore, The woman who had arrived with one suitcase and a folded letter and a decision made in a boarding house room in Missouri closed her eyes and stayed. She was up before the sun, not because anyone had asked her to be, not because there was a schedule posted on the wall or a bell that rang or a foreman who expected her at a certain hour. She was up because she had lain awake in the dark for the last hour of the night thinking about those empty shelves and lying still. While thinking about empty shelves was something she had never been able to do. She dressed in the dark. She took the lantern. She went downstairs. The kitchen was cold in the particular deep way that kitchens got cold when no one had fed the stove since the night before. She got the fire going first because everything else depended on heat, and while the stove was warming she went back to the pantry and looked at what she had to work with in the full honesty of early morning. 3 tins of dried beans, the partial sack of cornmeal, the nearly empty lard jar, the salt, the flavorless herbs, the soft potato. 4 eggs remaining from what Ethan had brought in the evening before because she had used 3 of the original 4 in last night's supper. She stood there a long moment. Then she went to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped out onto the porch. The sky was still purple dark at the edges, and the air had the clean, cold bite of a Montana morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was summer or something else. She could hear the horses in the barn. She could see the dim shapes of the outbuildings, the fence lines, the open land stretching out past the house in every direction. She walked to the hen house. 12 hens. A rooster who objected loudly to her presence. 7 eggs. She walked to the root cellar she had noticed yesterday at the side of the house, pulled back the heavy door and went down 3 steps into the cool dark. There were potatoes down here. A good amount, actually, maybe 30 pounds, maybe more. A few turnips. 3 jars of something preserved that she held up to the faint light coming down from the cellar door to identify apple preserves, 2 jars of green beans, and 1 unlabeled jar of dark red that might have been beet or might have been something else entirely. On a high shelf in the back, behind a crate of old tools, she found a cloth sack of dried corn that someone had stacked there and forgotten. She stood in the root cellar for a moment, and she recalculated. This was not nothing. This was actually something. What the Carter Ranch was suffering from was not poverty exactly. It was disorganization. It was the kind of chaos that settled in when the person who had held everything together was gone, and the people who remained were too exhausted and too broken to notice that they were working harder than they needed to and eating worse than they had to. She carried what she could up from the cellar and got to work. By the time the sky outside the kitchen window had gone from purple to gray to pale gold. Clara had a pot of porridge on the stove, the preserved green beans heating in a pan with a small piece of the dried corn worked in, and a pan of cornbread that had gone into the oven 40 minutes ago and was almost ready. She heard the first footsteps upstairs at 6. Then voices, or rather, one voice. Thomas saying something in a low, authoritative tone she couldn't make out, and the shuffle and thump of boys getting up and getting moving. Nathaniel came in from outside. He had been up earlier than her, apparently already in the barn. His coat was dusty, and his boots left a trail of dried grass across the kitchen floor. He stopped when he smelled the food. He looked at the stove. He looked at Clara. He looked at the table which she had already set. "You didn't have to," he started. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat. Joseph came through the door next and went directly to his chair without being told. Henry followed slower and took his place. Thomas came down the stairs and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the set table with an expression that was working hard not to show anything. "Where's William?" Clara asked. "Still upstairs," Thomas said. "Would you call him down?" Thomas's jaw tightened very slightly. "I can try." I went to the bottom of the stairs and raised his voice. "William, breakfast." Silence from above. "William." "I'm not hungry," came the voice from upstairs. Flat. Deliberate. Clara took the cornbread out of the oven, set it on the counter, and cut it into squares. She put the largest square on a plate and set it at the place at the table that no one had taken yet, the seat nearest the window, the one farthest from hers. She put a spoonful of the apple preserves beside it. Then she went to the bottom of the stairs herself. "William," she said. A long pause. "What?" "I found the apple preserves your mother put up in the root cellar. I heated some. If you don't want any, that's fine, but I'm not saving it. Another pause. Longer this time. She went back to the kitchen. 2 minutes later, William came downstairs. I didn't look at her. He walked to the table, sat down in the chair by the window, and looked at the plate with the apple preserves, like he was trying to decide if being interested in it was a betrayal of something important. He picked up his fork. He ate the entire portion of apple preserves before anything else. Clara watched nothing. She was busy dishing out the porridge. But she noticed. Nathaniel was watching too. The root cellar has a fair amount in it, Clara said, addressing the table in general. 30 pounds of potatoes, maybe more, 3 turnips, preserved vegetables, and a sack of dried corn that I expect nobody's thought about in a while. That was from 2 summers ago, Samuel said. He had come down during the commotion about William taking his seat quietly. We put it up, but then nobody... He stopped. Nobody got around to using it, Thomas finished. There was something careful in his voice. Well, we'll use it now, Clara said. She sat down. I'll need to go to town for some things. Flour, sugar, proper salt pork. Dried beans if there's money for it. She looked at Nathaniel when she said the last part. She kept her voice practical and even making it a logistical conversation and not a personal one. Nathaniel set down his spoon. I can give you what I can spare, he said. His voice was very level. It won't be much. How much is not much, he told her. It was not much. But Clara had grown up poor in a way that Nathaniel Carter, who had land, even if the land was struggling, had not. She knew exactly what you could do with not much. I can work with that, she said. William looked up from his plate for the first time since he'd sat down. He looked at her with the expression of a boy who had expected her to flinch, and she hadn't, and he didn't know what to do with that. There's flour at Garver's General, Thomas said. He'll let us put it on account. How much is on the account already? Clara asked. The table went quiet. Thomas looked at his father. Nathaniel looked at the table. A fair amount, he said. Clara nodded once. She stored that information and moved on. After breakfast, she said, I'd like someone to show me the full property, the barn, the pastures, the condition of the fences, everything. I'll do it, Samuel said. He said that quickly before anyone else could, and something shifted in the air at the table. Something that she couldn't read completely yet, but that had to do with the way the other boys looked at Samuel when he spoke, a kind of watchful waiting. Thank you, she said. That would help. Breakfast continued. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was present, and it was fed, and for the time being, that was enough. She and Samuel walked the property after the dishes were cleared, and he showed her everything without her having to ask twice for anything, which told her he was either naturally forthcoming or specifically trying to help her understand something. She thought it was probably both. The cattle herd was down to 63 head from a peak of over 100, he told her. Disease had taken some 2 years back. A bad winter had taken more. The ones that remained were decent animals, but they weren't being managed as well as they could be. The north fence had been in disrepair for the better part of a year. The hay stores were adequate but not comfortable. The small vegetable plot on the south side of the house had been completely abandoned. The soil was still good, she could see that, dark and deep, the kind of soil that would produce well if someone put work into it. But it had been unplanted for going on 3 years. Who planted it before? She asked. Samuel was quiet for a moment. They were standing at the edge of the old plot, looking at the weedy patch of nothing it had become. My mother, he said. She didn't push on that. They walked the fence line on the north pasture. 3 of the posts were down, and several more were leaning, and the wire had come away from the post in 2 places. It wasn't catastrophic. It could be fixed in a day with the right materials, but it was the kind of thing that was expensive to ignore. How much of this is your father seeing every day? She asked. Samuel looked at her. He had his mother's coloring like Thomas, but something softer in the eyes, a quality of observation that hadn't turned into hardness yet. He sees it, he said. He just doesn't have the energy to get to all of it. Something like that. She looked at the fallen fence posts. Samuel, she said, what would you fix first if it were you? He looked at the fence, then back toward the house, then out at the cattle in the pasture. He thought about it. She could see him taking it seriously. "The fence," he said. "Because if we lose cattle through that gap, we lose money we can't get back." "Then that's where we start," she said. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen in his face before. "We," he said. "Unless you'd rather do it alone," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. That afternoon, she found Thomas in the barn, doing something to the harness on the bay mare that involved a great deal of concentrated attention and very little actual progress. She had the feeling he had been in the barn for a while. She had the feeling the barn was where Thomas went when he needed to be somewhere that wasn't the house. She sat down on a hay bale without being invited. He kept working on the harness. "How long have you been running this household?" she asked. "Since I was 17, he said. "That's 4 years. "I know how old I am." "I'm not questioning it," she said. "I'm saying 4 years is a long time to carry something that was never supposed to be yours to carry." He stopped working on the harness. He didn't turn around. "Somebody had to," he said. "Yes," she said. "Somebody did. And you did it. But Thomas, you're 21 years old." He turned around then. His eyes were sharp and careful. "What's your point?" "My point," she said, "is that you've been the adult in that house since you were a boy, and nobody ever thanked you for it properly. And I imagine you've gotten so used to being in charge that having someone else come in and take over anything at all probably feels like you're failing at something." He stared at her. "I'm not here to take over," she said. "I'm here to help. There's a difference." A long silence. "The last woman who came here," he said, "told us she was going to make everything better. She reorganized the kitchen. She moved all the furniture around. She told Pa that what the boys needed was discipline and structure, and that she was going to provide it." He paused. "Henry didn't speak for 2 weeks after she left." "I know," Clara said. "You told me." "I'm telling you again. I heard you both times." She stood up. "What does Henry like, not what he used to like? What does he like now?" Thomas looked at her. "What?" "Henry. Your 12-year-old brother who doesn't talk much. What does he care about? What makes him come alive?" Thomas was very still. "He used to like drawing," he said slowly. "He drew all the time when he was little. Birds mostly. All kinds. He could identify every bird on this property by sight." "Does he still draw?" "I don't know," Thomas said. And the way he said it, the honesty of not knowing the faint shadow that crossed his face when he said it, told her more about this family than almost anything else had so far. "Okay," she said simply. She headed for the barn door. "Why are you asking about Henry?" Thomas called after her. "Because he's the one I'm most worried about," she said. And she walked back toward the house. She found Henry on the porch. He was sitting on the bottom step with a stick drawing lines in the dirt, and he looked up when she came out of the barn and then looked back down immediately. The way he did like eye contact was something he had to budget carefully. She sat down on the step beside him. Not close enough to crowd him. Close enough to be present. She said nothing. He said nothing. She watched what he was drawing in the dirt. Lines that turned into shapes. Shapes that became, she leaned slightly, a bird. A hawk, she thought, or an eagle, the wingspan caught in a few confident strokes that were better than they had any right to be from a stick in the dirt. "Is that a red-tailed hawk?" she asked. He looked up at her. His eyes went wide for just a moment. "How do you know what a red-tailed hawk looks like?" "My father kept a book," she said. "Birds of the American West. I used to read it cover to cover when I was your age." Henry looked back at his drawing. Something in his shoulders had shifted. "There's a pair nesting in the cottonwood by the north pasture," he said. He said it carefully, like he was offering something and wasn't sure it would be received. "I'd like to see them sometime," she said. "If you'd want to show me." He said nothing. But he didn't draw over what he'd made the way she'd half expected him to. He left the hawk in the dirt and looked at it. That was something. She went inside. The afternoon moved forward, and the tensions in the house moved with it, and by the time she was starting supper, she had a clearer picture of the shape of what she was dealing with. Not just the ranch and the finances, which were genuinely troubling, but the interior geography of this family, who held what, who needed what, who had built, which walls, out of which kind of pain. Nathaniel came through the kitchen at 4 o'clock. I was carrying the worry the way he always did, visible only if you knew to look for it in the set of his jaw and the slight tension around his eyes, and the way he moved through his own house like a man who wasn't entirely sure he belonged there anymore. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He stopped. "Go ahead." "The account at Garver's General. How much?" He told her the number. She kept her face even. "And the bank?" she asked. A pause that was one beat too long. "Nathaniel," she said, "I'm not here to judge you, but I can't help you if I don't know what we're actually dealing with." He leaned against the counter. He looked at the window for a moment. Then he told her. The debt was larger than she had expected. Not ruinous, not yet, but walking toward ruin at a pace that didn't leave a lot of room. He was behind on the mortgage payment by nearly 4 months. The cattle sale from the previous fall had been lower than projected. The cost of repairs on the barn roof had eaten money he'd planned to put toward the payment. And there was something else. He had borrowed money 2 years ago from a man named Caldwell Douglas. Caldwell, who owned 3 businesses in Red Hollow, and twice that many opinions about what he was owed. "What were the terms?" Clara asked. 18 months, he said. "I missed the extension." "What happens if you miss another payment?" He looked at the floor. "He has the right to file a lien on the property," he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "How much time do we have?" 6 weeks, maybe 8. She took that in. She did not let herself panic. She let herself think. "All right," she said. "Then that's what we're working with." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely identify, something between gratitude and grief. "I should have told you this before you came," he said. "You told me what you could," she said. "Now I know more. We'll figure it out." "Clara." "I said we'll figure it out." She handed him a pot. "Hold this for me." He held it. She worked around him in the kitchen, and he stayed, which she noted without commenting on. And by the time supper was ready, they had talked through 2 or 3 possibilities that at least gave her something to think about. And she could see in his face that he was slightly less alone inside his own head than he had been an hour ago. That mattered. Supper that night was fuller than the night before. Not just in terms of food, though there was more of it, the potatoes from the cellar, roasted with dried herbs, the green beans, proper and warm cornbread again, because the boys had eaten it without complaint, and she knew what that meant, but in terms of presence, Samuel talked. He described the fence situation with a specificity that told her he had been paying attention to the property, even if no one had asked him to, and when she responded with questions about the lumber and the wire she'd need, he answered all of them, and then some. Joseph told a story about something that had happened at school with a degree of dramatic embellishment that had Henry smiling into his plate, even. Nathaniel spoke. He said something to Thomas about the cattle rotation that was the most words she had heard him say at the table, and Thomas answered, and for a few minutes they talked back and forth like a father and son who remembered how to do that. William ate everything on his plate again. He still didn't say anything directly to her. But as the boys were clearing the table and drifting out of the kitchen, he stopped in the doorway and half turned back. "The apple preserves," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at a point slightly left of her shoulder. "Yes," she said. "There's more in the cellar," he said. "My mother made them. They've been there a while." He left before she could say anything. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with a dish in her hand, very still. William had just told her where his mother's preserves were. He had just told her to use them. She set the dish down carefully. She exhaled. That evening, after the house had gone quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, and she wrote down everything she knew. The debt numbers, the cattle count, the state of the root cellar, the abandoned garden plot, the fence, the account at Garver's. Then she started writing what she could do. The vegetable garden replanted now in early summer could produce through to fall. She knew vegetables. She knew canning. She knew what a well-managed kitchen garden could contribute to a household's survival through a Montana winter. She could bake. She had always been able to bake bread, especially pies, things that people wanted and would pay for, and Red Hollow had a general store, but it had no bakery. There were eggs enough for more than just the household if she managed the flock properly. And if Samuel was as capable as he seemed, and if Thomas could be convinced to let someone else help carry the weight he'd been carrying alone for 4 years, then the ranch work itself might become more efficient, might actually improve. It was possible. She wrote that word at the bottom of the page. Possible. Not certain. Not easy. But possible. She was still sitting at the table when she heard bare feet on the kitchen floor and looked up to find Ethan standing in the doorway in his nightshirt, rubbing one eye with his fist. "You're supposed to be asleep," she said. "I had a bad dream," he said. "Come here," she said. He came. He climbed into the chair beside her without asking and leaned his head against her arm. She could feel the weight of him, small and warm and solid, and she sat very still for a moment, because she was aware that this small person was putting his trust in her in the most uncomplicated and complete way that human beings could put their trust in each other, and she did not want to do anything that would disturb that. "What was the dream about?" she asked. "I was looking for everybody," he said. "But nobody was in the house." "We're all here," she said. "I know," he said. "But in the dream, we weren't." She put her arm around him. He was asleep again within 10 minutes right there in the kitchen chair, and she sat with him a while longer before she carried him upstairs and put him back in his bed. She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment. 6 years old, no memory of his mother, bare feet because his boots didn't fit, nightmares about being left behind. This was why she had come. Not because the letter had promised her stability, not because she had no other choice. Both of those things were true. She had come because some part of her had read the line in that letter. "I cannot do this alone anymore," and had recognized it, had known it from the inside. She went back to her room. She lay down in the dark. She thought about Douglas Caldwell and his lien. She thought about the fence and the cattle and the account at Garver's. She thought about Samuel's map under his mattress and Thomas's tired arms and William's careful cruelty and Henry's birds and Joseph's stories and Ethan's nightmares. She thought about Nathaniel's hands on the wagon reins and the way he had said she just turned 6 in a voice that cracked on the word 6, and he hadn't even known it. She thought about the apple preserves in the root cellar that his wife had put up and nobody had touched in 4 years. She closed her eyes. The next morning, she was up before the sun again. There was work to do. She got the fire going in the stove. She started the water heating. She put on her apron, and she began. 3 days passed that way. 4. 5. Each morning earlier than the one before, each evening later. The pattern of the household began to shift around her. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small, incremental way that real change happened by 1 degree at a time. By the 4th morning, Henry was in the kitchen before Joseph, something that had apparently never happened before. And when she raised an eyebrow, he said very quietly, "I thought you might want someone to get the eggs." She handed him the basket without a word. By the 5th evening, Samuel had started fixing the north fence. He hadn't told anyone he was going to do it. She had gone out after supper to check on the progress and found him working in the last of the light with a post-hole digger and a focused expression, and she had watched him for a moment without saying anything. "You're going to lose the light," she said. "I know," he said. "I've got one more post." "I'll bring a lantern," she said. She went back to the house and got the lantern and brought it back out and held it while he drove the last post. And they didn't talk much, but when it was done, he looked at the repaired section of fence in the lantern light with something she recognized as quiet satisfaction. "Good work," she said. He didn't say anything, but he stood a little straighter. On the 6th day, she started digging the garden. She was on her knees in the dirt with a trowel working the old soil up when she heard someone behind her and turned to find William standing a few feet away, with his arms crossed, watching her. She went back to digging. "What are you planting?" he asked. "Beans first," she said. "Squash. Tomatoes if I can find the starts." "There's a crate of old seed packets in the root cellar," he said, "on the shelf behind the preserves." She stopped digging and looked at him. I was still looking at the dirt, not at her. His jaw was set in the familiar way, but he was still there. "Can you go get them?" she asked. He uncrossed his arms. He went. She turned back to her digging and pressed her lips together to keep from smiling too broadly where anyone might see. William came back with the seed packets and set them beside her on the ground without comment. "Some of those are probably too old," he said, looking them over. "Some," she agreed. "Not all of them." He crouched down and picked through the packets. She watched him from the corner of her eye, this 15-year-old boy who kept people at the distance he thought he needed to survive, sorting through his dead mother's seed packets with his jaw set hard and his eyes doing something she wasn't supposed to notice. "The bean seeds are good," he said. "You can tell by the way they feel." He handed her the packet. She soaked them overnight first, before she planted them. "Did she?" Clara said. "Said they came up better that way." "That's good to know," she said. He stood up. He brushed his hands on his pants. He didn't leave immediately. "I'll get the water bucket," he said, "for soaking the seeds." He walked back to the house before she could answer. She sat in the dirt for a moment and looked at the seed packets and thought about a woman she had never met who had put up apple preserves in the root cellar and planted bean seeds, soaked overnight in water, and whose children still carried her in 1,000 ways they didn't even notice. She picked up her trowel. She kept digging. That evening at supper, for the first time since Clara had arrived, all 6 boys were at the table at the same time, without anyone having to call upstairs twice, or find someone in the barn, or issue a direct order. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table and looked around at his sons and at Clara and said nothing. But she saw it. The thing that moved across his face. It was there for only a moment, quickly covered, but she saw it plain. It was hope, not certainty, not happiness, not the resolution of anything that had been wrong, just hope. Small and careful and tender as a new plant in just-turned soil. She passed the bread and said something ordinary about the fence repair, and Samuel answered and the supper continued, and nobody named what they had all just felt, which was the right thing, because naming it too soon was how you killed it. But it was there, and it was real. And Clara Whitmore, who had come to Red Hollow, Montana, on a dusty stagecoach with 1 suitcase and a survival arrangement, and no particular expectation of more than that, sat at the Carter family table and felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt like she might be home. She did not let herself say that yet. She was not foolish enough to trust it so soon. But she felt it. And on the morning of the 7th day, she found out that Douglas Caldwell was coming to the ranch, and everything that had been quietly, carefully, tenderly building over the past week stopped. And the real fight began. She found out from Joseph. He had been in town the afternoon before with Thomas picking up a length of wire from Garver's General for the fence repair, and he had heard 2 men talking outside the feed store. He had not understood everything they said, but he had understood enough to come home and find Clara in the kitchen and stand in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and his face doing something careful and serious that 9-year-old faces were not designed to do. "Miss Clara," he said. She heard it in his voice immediately. She set down what she was holding and turned around. "What is it?" "Mr. Caldwell's coming tomorrow," he said. "I heard Mr. Garver telling somebody. He said Caldwell's been waiting long enough and he's coming out to the Carter ranch to have a conversation." Joseph paused. Mr. Garver didn't say it like a conversation was a good thing. Clara was still for a moment. "Did Thomas hear this?" "Yes," Joseph said. "He didn't say anything the whole ride home." She looked at the boy in the doorway. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You did the right thing." He nodded. He stayed in the doorway. "Is he going to take the ranch?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," she said. She said it quietly, and she said it plain. And Joseph looked at her for a moment, the way the boys had started looking at her when she said things like that, like they were measuring the distance between what she promised and what the world usually delivered, and finding themselves against every instinct they had built up over 4 years of disappointment wanting to believe her. She found Nathaniel in the barn. How was sitting on an overturned crate with his forearms on his knees and his hat in his hands and the look on his face of a man who already knew. "Joseph told me," she said. "I heard in town 2 days ago. Nathaniel said. He didn't look up. I was going to tell you. When? A silence. Nathaniel. He looked up. His eyes were tired in the deep, particular way of a man who had been carrying dread for days without setting it down anywhere. I didn't want to put more on your plate than I already had. That's not your decision to make, she said. Not anymore. We're in this together, or we're not in it together. Which is it? He looked at her for a long moment. Together, he said. The word came out rough, like it had been a long time since he'd said it and meant it. Then tell me everything about Douglas Caldwell, she said. And start from the beginning. He told her. Douglas Caldwell had come to Red Hollow 6 years ago from somewhere back east. Nobody knew exactly where, and those who had asked had received answers vague enough to make them stop asking. He had purchased the old Hendricks property on the south side of town and turned it into a general trading operation that had expanded over the years into money-lending land brokerage and a controlling interest in the only feed supplier within 30 miles. He was not a man who took losses well. He was not a man who forgot what he was owed. When Nathaniel had needed money 2 years ago after the bad winter, after the cattle disease, after the barn roof had collapsed in a storm, and he had burned through his reserves repairing it, Caldwell had been the only option outside the bank, and the bank had already been skeptical. The terms had seemed manageable at the time. They had not stayed manageable. What exactly does he have the right to do? Clara asked. His agreement with me gives him the right to file a lien on the property if I miss 2 consecutive payment periods, Nathaniel said. I've missed 4. Can he foreclose? Not without the bank, but he can file the lien and make it almost impossible to sell or refinance. He can tie up the property in legal processes long enough to strangle us. He paused. He's done it before. To the Bauer family 2 years ago. They were gone inside 6 months. Clara was quiet. How much do we owe him total? He told her. She stood with that number for a moment. What does he want? She asked. Not what does he have the legal right to take. What does he actually want? Nathaniel looked at her. The north pasture, he said. She went very still. The one Samuel just fixed the fence on. It's the best land on the property, best soil, best water access. He's had his eye on it since before I borrowed from him. His jaw tightened. I think that's why he offered the loan. Clara stood in the barn and let herself feel very briefly the full weight of that. The predatory patience of it. A man who had offered what looked like help and had been waiting the whole time for the moment he could collect what he actually wanted. Then she put the feeling away and started thinking. What time is he coming? She asked. He didn't send word. He'll come when he comes. Then when we need to be ready before he gets here. She turned and walked back to the house. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and she ran numbers. She turned over possibilities. She thought about the money she had come here with, $22.30, which she had not spent, which sat folded in the inside pocket of her traveling coat, which was not enough to make a dent in what Caldwell was owed, but which was something. She thought about the bread. She had been baking extra loaves every other day, more than the household needed, and Thomas had been taking them into town when he went for supplies, selling them at Garver's counter on a handshake arrangement. 3 loaves at 12 cents each. It was small, but it was consistent, and it was growing because word had gotten around that the bread was good. She thought about the garden. 6 weeks old now, and coming in strong, the beans first, then the squash, the tomatoes, green and climbing. She had been canning the surplus green beans from the cellar stores and putting up new jars every week. She thought about the 12 hens producing 7 eggs a day, and the fact that she had been selling the surplus to Garver's as well at 9 cents a dozen, and that she had a reliable buyer in Mrs. Aldrich from the millinery who sent her daughter by once a week for 2 dozen. Small. All of it small. But she lay in the dark, and she added it up, and she thought small things add up. Small things add up if you don't stop. She was up at 4:30. Nathaniel came downstairs at 5 and found her at the kitchen table with the piece of paper she'd been writing on all week. The one with the numbers and the possibilities, and the word possible at the bottom, and 3 new pages beside it. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. Did you sleep? He asked. Some, she said. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd already made and sat down across from her. He looked at the papers. What is all this? Everything I can account for, she said. Income from the bread, the eggs, the canned goods, the cattle value, if we sell the 3 oldest steers now, rather than waiting. The garden yield projection through fall. She pushed the papers toward him. It's not enough to clear what you owe Caldwell, but it's enough to show we're producing, that we're moving in a direction. He picked up the papers and read. She watched his face as he read. Clara, he said, I know it's not the number he wants. It's more than I thought we had, he said. He said it quietly, like something had shifted in him. We have more than you think, she said. You just haven't been able to see it because you've been carrying all of this alone. He set his papers down. He looked at her across the table. Why are you doing this? He asked. Not accusing, genuinely asking. Because it's my home now too, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away first. But something in his face had changed. The boys came down to breakfast, and the mood in the kitchen was tight, in a way they all felt immediately. Thomas sat down with the expression of a man bracing for something. Samuel was quiet. Even Joseph didn't tell any stories. Clara put breakfast on the table, and then sat down and looked at all of them. You all know Caldwell is coming today, she said. Nobody said anything. That was confirmation enough. I want you to know that whatever happens, I need you to let your father and me handle it, she said. That means nobody says anything they don't need to say. Nobody escalates anything, and nobody, she looked at William, does anything that gives that man more ammunition than he already has. William looked back at her steadily. What if he says something he shouldn't? Then I will handle it, she said. You, William said. It wasn't quite disbelief, but it was close. Me, she said. She held his gaze. Do you trust me? A long pause. I don't know yet, he said. That's honest, she said. I'll take it. Caldwell arrived at 10 in the morning. He drove a black buggy with good horses, and he was dressed for business, not ranch business, but the kind of business that happened in offices. Dark coat, clean boots, a hat that hadn't been worn in the weather. He was somewhere between 50 and 60. Heavy-set with the kind of face that had been handsome once in a blunt-featured way and had curdled into something harder as the years went on. He climbed down from the buggy and looked at the ranch with the expression of a man who was already calculating what it was worth. Nathaniel met him in the yard. Clara stood on the porch. Carter, Caldwell said. He did not extend his hand. Caldwell, Nathaniel said. He did not extend his either. You should have sent word. I sent enough word over the past 8 months, Caldwell said. He looked past Nathaniel at the house at the porch, at Clara standing on it. His eyes settled on her with a kind of measuring interest. Who's this? My wife, Nathaniel said. Caldwell's expression shifted. Something recalculated behind his eyes. Didn't know you'd remarried. It's recent, Nathaniel said. Caldwell looked at Clara for another moment. Then he looked back at Nathaniel. We need to talk about the situation. Come inside, Nathaniel said. Clara went ahead of them into the house and put coffee on without being asked, and set 3 cups on the kitchen table and sat down in the chair nearest the window, the one from which she could see both men and the door at the same time. Caldwell came in and looked at the set table and at Clara sitting at it, and something moved across his face that she read clearly. He had not expected her to be in the room for this conversation. He had expected to sit across from Nathaniel and have the conversation he had already planned. He sat down. Nathaniel sat across from him. Clara poured the coffee. 4 missed payments, Caldwell said. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and laid it on the table between them. The agreement is clear. I'm aware of the agreement, Nathaniel said. Then you're aware that I have the right to file the lien. You have the right, Nathaniel said. That doesn't mean it's what either of us wants. Caldwell looked at him, then he looked at Clara. Mrs. Carter, he said, I appreciate you making coffee, but this is a business conversation between your husband and myself. Clara looked at him. She smiled pleasantly. Of course it is, she said. "And I'm his wife, so I'm involved in the business." Caldwell's expression did not change. "The debt is in your husband's name. The ranch is now our shared household," she said. "Anything that affects the ranch affects me. I think you'll find that's how it works." A beat of silence. Caldwell looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing, but he didn't tell her to leave, and the not telling carried its own weight. Caldwell picked up his coffee cup. 4 months behind. The amount outstanding is... He named the figure. "We know the figure," Clara said. He looked at her. "We also know," she said, "that what you're actually interested in is the north pasture, not the money." The air in the kitchen changed. Nathaniel went very still. Caldwell set his cup down slowly. "That's quite a statement." "Is it inaccurate?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted from dismissive to something else, more careful. "The north pasture is part of the Carter property," he said. "If I file a lien, you could tie the property up for 6 months in legal proceedings and eventually force a sale," she said. "I know how it works. You did it to the Bowers." His jaw tightened. "The Bowers had no way to service their debt," he said. "Neither do we," she said. "Right now. But the situation is changing." "Mrs. Carter, I'd like to make you a proposal," she said. He stared at her. Nathaniel stared at her. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her folded piece of paper and laid it on the table between them. "We are 6 weeks behind on where we need to be," she said. "I know that. We're not here to pretend otherwise. What I want to show you is what has changed in the last 3 weeks since I arrived and what I project will change over the next 6 months." She walked him through it. The bread sales, the egg income, the canning surplus, the cattle schedule, the garden yield. She spoke calmly and specifically with numbers without apology. She let the picture build the way it built when you looked at it honestly. Caldwell listened. I was not a man who was easily impressed. She could see that. But she could also see him processing the numbers the way a businessman processed numbers, unconsciously, automatically, the calculation happening behind his eyes, whether he wanted it to or not. "This is what one woman with an apron and a root cellar has built in 3 weeks, she said. "Imagine what 6 months looks like." "This doesn't cover the outstanding amount," he said. "No," she said. "It doesn't. What it covers is a substantial portion of the first 2 overdue payments if you allow us to restructure the schedule. And what it shows you is a household that is producing and growing rather than declining." The agreement gives you the right to file a lien," she said. "It doesn't obligate you to. You have the option to work with us toward a resolution that is financially better for you than a lien process that ties up a property for 6 months and costs you legal fees and time." She paused. "You're a businessman, Mr. Caldwell. A lien is a weapon. This," she tapped the paper, "is a deal." Caldwell looked at her for a very long time. Nobody in the kitchen spoke. From somewhere upstairs came the very faint sound of floorboards. The boys she knew, positioned in the hallway above them, listening to every word through the thin floor. She had known they would be there. She had spoken accordingly. "You have a persuasive wife, Carter," Caldwell said. He did not say it as a compliment exactly, but there was something in his voice that was not what it had been when he walked in. Nathaniel said quietly, "She usually gets there before I do." Caldwell looked at the paper again. He turned it slightly to read a column of figures. He drummed 2 fingers on the table once. "I'll agree to a 60-day extension," he said. "Not a restructure, an extension. If you miss any portion of the agreed payment at the end of 60 days, the lien process begins immediately. No further negotiation." Clara looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at her. "Agreed," she said. Caldwell folded his document back into his coat. He picked up his coffee and finished it. He stood. "I'll have my man draw up the amendment," he said. "I'll send it out this week." "We'll be here," she said. He looked at her one more time at the door. There was something in his expression she couldn't entirely read, not respect, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had underestimated something and was revising. "Carter," he said to Nathaniel, "you've got more going on here than I thought you had." He left. The black buggy rolled out of the yard. Clara stood on the porch and watched it go. Behind her, the front door opened and Joseph came bursting out. "Did we win?" he demanded. "Did you win?" "We bought time," she said. "That's not the same as winning." "But we're not losing today." She looked at him. "No," she said. "Not today." He pumped his fist once privately at his side, like a boy trying to be restrained about something he was very not restrained about. She went back inside. The kitchen felt different without Caldwell in it. Larger. The boys had come downstairs while she'd been on the porch, and they were arranged around the room. Thomas standing at the counter, Samuel in the doorway, Henry by the table, William in the corner near the window, Ethan on his stool. Nathaniel was standing in the middle of the room. He looked at Clara when she came in. "You knew about the north pasture," he said. "How?" "You told me it was the best land," she said. "And then you told me he'd had his eye on it. The rest was just logic." He could have walked away from that table angry. He could have, she agreed. But he didn't. "You were betting on him being more interested in the money than in being right." "I was betting on him being a businessman," she said. "Which he is." Thomas said from the counter, 60 days is not a lot of time." "No," she said. "It isn't. So we need to work harder than we have been." "We're already working hard," Samuel said. "Harder than that," she said. She looked around the room at all of them. At Nathaniel, at the 5 older boys, at Ethan on his stool with his bare feet tucked up under him. "All of us together, not each of you separately. Together." Something passed through the room. Something that was not yet agreement, but was moving in that direction. William said from the corner, "What do you need?" She looked at him. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his jaw set in the usual way. But he was looking at her directly, and he had asked. "I need the cattle sale moved up," she said. "The 3 oldest steers before the fall market. Samuel, can we get a fair price if we take them to Billings rather than selling local?" "Better price in Billings," Samuel said. $30, maybe $40 better per head." "Then that's where they go," she said. "I need the garden harvesting accelerated, Henry. I know you've been watching the squash come in. I need to know how much we can realistically put up before the end of summer." Henry blinked. He had not expected to be addressed directly in a strategy conversation. 50 jars, he said after a moment. "Maybe 60 if the late tomatoes come in strong." "Good," she said. "Thomas, the bread sales at Garver's. I need you to ask him if he'll take 5 loaves a week instead of 3. Tell him we'll reduce the price slightly for volume." Thomas looked at her. "He might say yes," he said slowly. "His wife used to bake for the store. She's been ill this year." "Then he needs us," she said. "And we need him. That's the basis of a good arrangement." She looked at all of them. 60 days, she said. "That's what we have, and we're going to use every one of them." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Ethan said from his stool in his small, serious voice, "I can help with the eggs." Everybody looked at him. "I've been getting them every morning," he said. "And I know where the hen with the speckled feathers hides hers. She goes behind the old feed box. Nobody checks there." Joseph let out a short laugh. Henry smiled into the floor. Even William in the corner uncrossed his arms. Nathaniel looked at his youngest son, and something moved through his expression, quick and deep there, and gone. That Clara stored carefully in the part of herself that was paying attention to what this family needed most. He needed to see them. Not just provide for them. Actually see them. "Good man, Ethan," Nathaniel said. Ethan sat up straight on his stool like someone had put a spine in him. The kitchen began to move again. Boys dispersed to their work. Nathaniel followed Thomas outside to discuss the cattle. The house filled with the ordinary sounds of a household in motion. Clara stood at the counter. Samuel stopped beside her on his way out. "That was something," he said quietly. "It was a 60-day extension," she said. "That's not what I meant," he said. He went outside. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. She thought about what it had felt like to sit across from Douglas Caldwell with her piece of paper and her numbers and her carefully built argument, and to feel the room shifting, to feel the weight of what he held, balanced against what she was offering, and to watch him very slowly tip toward reason. She had been afraid. She had not shown it. but her hands had been flat on the table, because if she'd held them in her lap, they would have been shaking. She pressed them flat on the counter now and took a breath. 60 days. She picked up her apron. She went back to work. But something had shifted in the house, and she could feel it. Not just in the movement of the boys, not just in the way Thomas had listened, and Samuel had calculated, and even William had asked what she needed. It was something less visible than any of that. It was the way Nathaniel had stood in the middle of the kitchen after Caldwell left and looked at her. Not like she was a woman who had come to help with his sons. Not like she was a useful arrangement. Something different. Something that neither of them had language for yet, or at least neither of them had used it. She tied her apron. She started on the bread dough. The days that followed moved with a new urgency that was different from the grinding, exhausted forward motion the Carter Ranch had been managing before. This was directed. This had a deadline. And there was something about a shared deadline. Clara had learned that could do what months of gentleness sometimes couldn't. It could make people work together who had forgotten how. Thomas went to Garver's and came back with an agreement for 5 loaves a week. He reported it to Clara with the careful neutrality he used for everything, but there was something underneath it. A faint satisfaction, the look of a man who had gone into a negotiation and not lost. Samuel drove the 3 steers toward Billings with a ranch hand from the neighboring property who agreed to accompany him in exchange for a fair split of the travel cost. He was gone 4 days. He came back with $114, which was $32 more than the best local offer would have been. And he put the money on the kitchen table in front of Clara with a look on his face that was the closest thing to triumphant she had seen from him. The garden gave what Henry had projected and then went slightly past it. Clara canned until her arms ached. Ethan got the eggs every morning, including from behind the old feed box, and he reported the count to Clara at breakfast with the seriousness of a boy conducting important business. And slowly, not dramatically, not all at once, the number on Clara's piece of paper began to move. It was at the end of the 3rd week, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, when the supper was just supper and nobody was in crisis, and the light coming through the kitchen window was gold and low, that William sat down at the kitchen table while she was working and said without preamble, "I want to learn to bake the bread." Clara kept kneading. "Then pull up a stool," she said. He pulled up a stool. She taught him. How was not naturally patient. He worked the dough too hard, at first impatient with the process, but he was precise when he wanted to be, and he asked questions that showed he was actually thinking about what he was doing, rather than just going through the motions. By the end of the evening, he had produced a passable loaf. He looked at it. "It's not as good as yours," he said. "It's your first one," she said. "Mine weren't either." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother tried to teach me once," he said. "I didn't want to learn." He paused. "I was 12. Clara said nothing. She let that sit where it needed to sit. "I should have let her teach me," he said. Very quiet. "You were 12, she said gently. "Still," he said. She looked at him. This 15-year-old boy with his jaw always set tight, and his arms always crossed, and his careful cruelty that was really just grief-wearing armor. "She knew you loved her," Clara said. 12-year-olds don't have to say it right." He looked at the loaf of bread. His jaw worked for a moment. "You didn't know her," he said. "No," she said. "But I know you. And I can see her all over you. The way you took care of those seed packets. The way you knew how she soaked the beans." She paused. "She's still here, William. She's in all of you." He didn't say anything. But he didn't leave the kitchen either. He sat on the stool beside her for another hour while she worked, saying very little present in the way that meant more than talking. And that night at supper, for the first time since Clara had arrived at the Carter Ranch, William passed her the bread basket without being asked. He just reached over and put it in front of her. He didn't look at her when he did it. But Thomas saw. And Samuel saw. And across the table, Nathaniel saw. Nobody said a word about it. But the table felt different. It was 10 days before the 60-day deadline that Caldwell's amendment arrived by messenger, signed, sealed, formal. Clara read it line by line at the kitchen table, with Nathaniel beside her, and when she reached the end, she set it down and said, "It's clean, no hidden terms." Nathaniel picked it up and read it himself. He could have buried something in the payment schedule language, he said. He could have, she said. He didn't. He set the document down. Why do you think? He asked. She thought about it. Because he's a man who wants to win, she said. But he wants to win a fair fight, or at least one that looks like one. She paused. We gave him a deal that looked fair. He's holding to it. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Then he looked at her and said, Clara, what you did that day with Caldwell, I need you to know something. She waited. I had already given up, he said. He said it simply without drama, the way a man said a hard truth he'd been carrying too long. Before you got here, I had already decided there was nothing left to do but wait for it to end. The kitchen was quiet around them. I know, she said. You saved this ranch, he said. We saved this ranch, she said. You, me, your boys. She paused. All of us. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm glad you stayed, he said. She held his gaze. I told you I would, she said. Outside, she could hear Samuel and Thomas working in the yard, the sounds of the fence repair that had spread from the north pasture to the east line, now that Samuel had the momentum going. She could hear Joseph somewhere near the root cellar talking to Henry about something she couldn't make out. She could hear Ethan singing a small, tuneless song near the henhouse. And somewhere in the house, she could smell bread. William's second loaf in the oven, better than his first. She could tell already. William's second loaf was better than his first. Clara knew it the moment she cut into it. The crust had the right sound, a firm crack that gave way to something soft and even inside. And William stood at the counter watching her cut it with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the usual way, but his eyes were doing something different. Well, he said. She tasted it. She looked at him. Garver's customers are going to ask who made this, she said. He looked away immediately, like the compliment was something he needed to get distance from before he could deal with it. But the line of his shoulders changed. Something loosened. It's just bread, he said. Just bread is what keeps this family going right now, she said. Don't underestimate just bread. He picked up the remaining heel and ate it standing at the counter. And for a moment, just a moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a 15-year-old boy who had done something right and wanted someone to notice. She noticed. She didn't make a production of it. She simply moved on because William was the kind of boy who needed things said once and clearly and then left alone to settle. But she noted it. She stored it. And she thought, this is how it happens. Not in the grand gestures. In the bread. The 49th day of the 60-day extension fell on a Thursday. Clara had known the date was approaching, the way you knew a storm was coming in Montana, not by seeing it yet. But by the way, the air changed and the animals got quiet and everything in you that paid attention to the world started paying closer attention. The numbers were close. Not comfortable, not safe, but close. She had the bread sales now 5 loaves a week at Garver's and 2 additional loaves sold direct to Mrs. Aldrich at the millinery, who had started ordering for her own household after tasting a sample Clara had sent with her egg delivery. She had the egg income steady and growing since Ethan had found 2 additional hens secreting eggs in places nobody had thought to look. She had the canned goods, 63 jars in total, green beans, tomatoes, squash, preserves, 3 varieties of pickled vegetables that she had begun selling from the house directly when word got around, as word did get around in a town the size of Red Hollow. She had the cattle money from Samuel's Billings run. She had the reorganized household accounts which she had spent 3 evenings untangling from the state of loose receipts and half-finished ledger pages she'd found in Nathaniel's desk. And she had something she had not counted on, $50 from Thomas. He had put it on the kitchen table 11 days ago on a Sunday evening after supper, and he had stood there with his hands in his pockets and waited for her to ask where it came from. I'm asking, she said. Winnings, he said. She looked at him. There's a stock competition in Miles City every fall, he said. I entered our bay mare in the working horse category 2 years running, never won anything. He paused. I entered her again in July. I didn't tell Pa because I didn't want him to get his hopes up. You went to Miles City in July, she said, without telling anyone. I was gone 2 days. I told Thomas. He stopped. I told Samuel I was going to check the east fence. You told Samuel a lie. I told Samuel a partial truth, he said. The fence does need checking. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back steadily. He was 18 years old, and he had a map under his mattress, and he had just come back from a competition. He'd entered without telling his father, and he had put $50 on her kitchen table, like a man contributing to something he had decided to contribute to. Does your father know about the competition? She asked. He will now, I reckon, Thomas said. He glanced at the doorway. Nathaniel was somewhere in the house within earshot. I'm going to tell him. Tell me what? Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway. Samuel looked at the floor. Then he looked up and told his father everything. The competition, the 2 years of losing the July trip, the bay mare, the $50. The kitchen was very quiet while he talked. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. Clara watched his face. She could see the layers moving through it. Surprise, then something that took her a moment to identify, then something she recognized clearly. Pride. You entered her in the working class, Nathaniel said when Samuel finished. Yes, sir. She's got the best left shoulder rotation in the county, Nathaniel said. He said it like someone saying something he had always known and never said out loud. I always said that. I know, Samuel said. That's why I entered her. Another silence. Something passing between father and son that was old and complicated and tender, and had been waiting a long time for a moment like this. You should have told me, Nathaniel said. I know, Samuel said. I was afraid you'd say no. I would have said no, Nathaniel admitted. And I would have been wrong. Samuel blinked. Nathaniel picked up the $50 from the table and set it back down again. He looked at Clara. Put it in the Caldwell fund, he said. It's already there, she said. He looked at her. Something in his eyes, warm and complicated and very direct. He looked away first, the way he always did, but the looking was getting longer. She had noticed that. The looking was getting longer every time. The 49th day arrived, and Clara sat at the kitchen table before sunrise and added everything up one final time. They were still $11 short. $11. She put her pencil down. She sat in the dark kitchen, and she thought about that number. $11. After everything, the bread and the eggs and the 63 jars and the bay mare and the Billings cattle run, and the 5 weeks of working harder than any of them had worked before. $11 was still sitting between them and what they owed. She was still sitting there when the sky started to go light outside. She was still sitting there when she heard the sound she had learned to recognize as Nathaniel's particular footstep on the stairs. Heavier than the boys, steadier with the careful weight of a man who moved through his own house like he was trying not to disturb anything. He came into the kitchen. He looked at her at the table with her papers and her pencil. He looked at her face. He sat down. How short? He asked. $11, she said. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at the papers. I have 7 in the tin by the stove, he said. Emergency money. I know about the tin, she said. I've been keeping it out of the calculations deliberately. Why? Because I wanted it to be the last resort, she said. Not the first. He nodded. That's still 4 short. She pressed her lips together. $4. They sat with that for a moment. Then the back door opened, and Henry came in from the henhouse with the egg basket, his face still soft with sleep, and he set the basket on the counter and turned around and looked at both of them sitting at the table in the early light and said, How much do you need? Clara looked at him. What do you mean? Henry reached into the front pocket of his shirt. He put $3.60 on the table. Coins, mostly a small folded bill. Clara stared at it. Where did that come from? Nathaniel asked. I've been drawing birds, Henry said. He said it simply like it was obvious. For people in town. Mrs. Garver asked me to draw her canary. She gave me 75 cents. Mr. Aldrich wanted a picture of the red-tailed hawk for his office. He paused. Joseph helped me deliver them. Clara looked at her 12-year-old stepson. Henry shrugged, his characteristic silence coming back over him like he'd said more than he meant to and needed to retreat into it. It's $3.60, he said. I know it's not enough. It's 40 cents short, she said. "I have 40 cents," said a voice from the doorway. Joseph was standing there in his nightshirt, clearly having followed Henry down and been listening from the hall. He held out 2 coins. Clara looked at the coins. She looked at Joseph, 9 years old and barefoot in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Henry, who had spent weeks drawing birds for people in town, and said nothing about it. She pressed her hand flat on the table. She breathed. "Bring that here," she said to Joseph. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He crossed the kitchen and put the coins on the table. She picked up her pencil. She wrote the final number. She added the 7 from Nathaniel's tin. She added Henry's 360. She added Joseph's 40 cents. The sum was exact, to the dollar. She put the pencil down. Nathaniel was looking at the table. He picked up one of Joseph's coins and turned it over in his fingers. He set it back down. He didn't say anything for a long moment. When he did speak, his voice was lower than usual. "Your mother would be proud of you both," he said. Henry looked at the floor. His jaw was working. Joseph made the movement. Clara had come to recognize as his version of emotional dignity. Chin up, eyes wide and bright, very carefully, not doing whatever he was feeling. Thomas appeared in the doorway. He looked at the table, at the money, at his father's face, at Clara's. He read the room in the way Thomas read everything completely quickly, without needing to be told. "Did we make it?" he asked. "We made it," Clara said. Thomas closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "I'll get the wagon ready," and turned and walked back toward the front of the house, and Clara could hear in his footsteps something she had not heard there before. Relief. Unguarded and full and real. She looked around the kitchen at these people. Nathaniel with the coin in his fingers, Henry studying the floor, Joseph radiating careful dignity, the sound of Thomas in the hallway, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Red Hollow, Montana 7 weeks ago with 1 suitcase and a survival arrangement. She thought about how wrong she had been about what she was walking into, not in the hard ways. The hard ways had been exactly as hard as she'd expected, and some of them harder. But in the other thing, the thing she hadn't let herself expect. She cleared her throat. "All right," she said. "Thomas, hold the wagon. Let me get the money counted properly first. Henry, there are eggs to sort. Joseph, I need you to—" "Miss Clara," Joseph said. She stopped. He walked to her chair, and he put both arms around her from behind a child's complete and unself-conscious embrace. His chin on her shoulder, and he said against her ear, "We kept it." She put her hand over his arms. "We kept it," she agreed. She held herself together by the slimmest margin. She was still holding herself together 40 minutes later when she and Nathaniel drove into Red Hollow with the full payment in an envelope in her lap, and she sat in the wagon and watched the town come into view and thought about the woman she had been 3 weeks ago, sitting across from Douglas Caldwell with her hands flat on the table and her voice steady and her heart going hard enough to feel in her throat. They went to Caldwell's office on the north end of Main Street, which Clara had not been to before and which was exactly what she had expected. Clean organized the desk of a man who kept track of things because keeping track was how he held power. Caldwell looked up when they came in. He looked at the envelope in Clara's hand. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at Clara. She put the envelope on his desk. "Count it," she said. He counted it. He sat back in his chair when he was done. Something moved through his expression that she spent a moment studying. "Full amount," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at Nathaniel, then back at her. "I'll have the amendment marked satisfied and file the release this afternoon," he said. "You'll have the paperwork by end of week." "Thank you," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "I had 6 other ranches I was watching this season," he said. 2 of them I've already filed on. 1 I'm watching still." He paused. "Yours was the one I expected least to survive." She held his gaze. "And now?" Something crossed his face. "And now I know better," he said. She nodded once. She stood up. Nathaniel shook Caldwell's hand briefly, correctly, without warmth but without hostility, and they walked out into the main street of Red Hollow. They stood on the boardwalk for a moment. Nathaniel looked up and down the street. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. He looked at her. The full morning sun was on his face, and she could see him clearly, the tiredness still there, the grief still present, the way it would always be present, but something else too. Something that had been gone for a long time, and had come back so gradually that she hadn't noticed it happening until she saw it now fully formed in the light of a Main Street morning. He was present. In his own life. In his own body. In the moment he was standing in. He was there. "Clara," he said. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. "When I wrote that letter, the advertisement," he said, "I told myself it was practical, that I needed help with the boys, that it was a matter of the ranch needing a capable woman." He paused. "I told myself a lot of things." "Most of them true," she said. "Most," he agreed. "But there was something I didn't write in the letter, something I didn't admit to myself." He stopped, started again. "I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone in my corner. Someone who showed up. Not because they had to, because they chose to." His jaw worked for a moment. "You choose to every day. I watch you. You choose it every morning at 4:30 when you go downstairs, and you start the fire, and you start working, and you don't stop." She was very still. "I'm not good at saying things like this," he said. "I know," she said. "But I want you to know, Nathaniel." She looked at him straight. "I know." He held her gaze. "Do you?" he said. "Yes," she said. "And you should know the same. I choose this. I choose all of it." She paused. "I choose you." They stood on the boardwalk of Red Hollow, Montana, and between them, something settled quietly without drama, the way real things settled into a shape that would hold. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back to the wagon together. The ranch looked different when they came home. Clara knew the building hadn't changed. The barn was the same barn, the house the same house. But she had come to understand that a place didn't look like itself until the people in it were looking at it right. And she and Nathaniel pulled the wagon into the yard in the early afternoon light, and she saw it clearly for the first time as something that was hers. Not borrowed, not temporary. Hers. The boys were all outside, which was unusual for the middle of the afternoon. Thomas and Samuel near the barn. Henry at the edge of the garden, Joseph and Ethan on the porch, and they all turned when the wagon came in. Thomas's face asked the question before he said it. "Well," he called. "It's done," Nathaniel said. "Leon's released. Ranch is ours." Thomas nodded once. He pressed his lips together. He turned back to whatever he was doing. Samuel sat down on the fence rail and stared at the north pasture for a moment. Clara watched his shoulders move with a breath. Henry looked at the garden. Joseph shouted something wordless and entirely joyful, and then seemed to remember he was 9 and not 6, and brought it down to a vigorous nod. Ethan ran off the porch and across the yard and grabbed Nathaniel around the legs. Nathaniel looked down at his youngest son. He bent down and picked him up. He had not. Clara realized watching it. He had not picked Ethan up in the time since she had been here. She didn't know how long before that it had been. But the way Ethan grabbed on arms tight around his father's neck face, pressed against his shoulder, told her it had been too long. Nathaniel held him. He closed his eyes for a moment. Clara looked away. That evening, she made the biggest supper she could manage from what they had in the house, which by now was considerably more than it had been 7 weeks ago. She cooked with the comfortable authority of a woman in her own kitchen, moving between the stove and the counter. The way you moved when a space had become yours, through the accumulated investment of thousands of small decisions. The boys set the table without being asked, all 6 of them. Thomas brought the plates down. Samuel carried the water pitcher. Henry set the William's loaf, which had been in the oven that afternoon, at the center of the table. Joseph arranged the chairs with the solemn precision of a boy who had decided this was an important occasion and was treating it accordingly. Ethan put the jar of apple preserves at each end of the table, 1 jar in front of each head. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them for a moment. Nobody told them to do it. Nobody organized them. They just did it, together, each one knowing his part. 7 weeks ago, she had arrived at a house where nobody came to the table without being called, where the kitchen was a place you passed through rather than gathered in, where 6 boys and their father had been living in the same space and slowly starving on every level that mattered. She stood in the doorway, and she felt it hit her, the full accumulated weight of what the past 7 weeks had been and what they had become, and she held it together because supper was ready and the family was at the table. Nathaniel held her chair for her when she sat down. It was the first time he had done that. She sat down. The family was all there, all 8 of them at the table. The bread was in the center. The preserves were open. The food was warm, and nobody spoke for a moment. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some moments were full enough that words were almost beside the point. Then Thomas said, "William made that bread." And William said without looking up, "I know how to read a recipe." And Joseph said, "He burned the first one. I did not burn it. It was very dark on the bottom." That is a different thing than burned. It tasted burned. It tasted caramelized. Henry very quietly into his plate. It tasted burned. And the table broke open, not into chaos, but into laughter, real and present and unguarded. The laughter of people who had been serious for a very long time and had just found a reason not to be, and it moved around the table and caught each person and took them over, and Clara sat in the middle of it and laughed too freely until her eyes stung. Nathaniel laughed last and longest. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. She stored that too. Later after supper, after the dishes were cleared and the boys had dispersed to their various end-of-evening places, Clara went out to the porch and sat down in the chair that had become her chair in the evenings. Nobody had said. It was her chair, but nobody sat in it either. The Montana sky had gone deep blue at the edges, and the stars were coming out hard and bright. She heard the door behind her. Nathaniel came out and sat in the chair beside her. They sat in the quiet for a while. "Thomas asked me something today," he said. "What?" "He asked me if I thought you were going to stay." She turned to look at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I hoped so," he said. He paused. "He told me hoping wasn't good enough." She said nothing. "He's right," Nathaniel said. He turned to look at her. "Clara, I know this didn't start the way things are supposed to start. I know what it was what I offered you. A practical arrangement. A letter about needing help." "I know what you offered," she said. "What I want to offer now is different," he said. She held his gaze. "I want to offer you this," he said. He gestured at the ranch, at the house, at the starlit sky, at all of it. "Not as a place to stay. As home. Actually home. Because you've made it one and I don't—" His voice caught slightly. I don't want you to be here because you have nowhere else to go. I want you to be here because you want to be here." She looked at him for a long moment. "Nathaniel," she said, "I stopped being here because I had nowhere else to go about 3 days after I arrived." He looked at her. "I've been here because I wanted to be," she said. "For a while now." He was quiet. "You didn't notice?" she asked. "I noticed," he said. "I just didn't want to assume." "Don't assume," she said. "Just know." He looked at her the way he had been looking at her more often lately, long and direct and complicated. Then he looked out at the ranch. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "Samuel is going to leave," he said. "Eventually. That map under his mattress, I've known about it for a year." She said nothing. "I used to think about stopping him," Nathaniel said. "Convincing him the ranch needed him, which it does." He paused. "But I've been thinking lately that a man who stays because he's been convinced to isn't really staying." "No," she said. "He isn't. I want to talk to him," he said. "Tell him I know. Tell him that when he's ready, I want him to go with my blessing instead of without it." Clara looked at him. This man who had spent 4 years turned inward managing grief by managing distance. This man who had written a letter she'd read in a boarding house room in Missouri and recognized bone deep as the voice of someone who had run out of road. "That's the right thing," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I'm not always slow to get there, just slow." "I know," she said. They sat in this quiet. The stars were fully out now, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. From inside the house came the muffled sounds of the boys at their end-of-evening movements. Thomas's careful footsteps. Joseph's voice telling Henry something, William's door closing with its particular sound. Ethan singing his small tuneless song in the room at the top of the stairs. The sounds of a house that was alive. Nathaniel reached over and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a long time in the dark and the starlight on the porch of the ranch that belonged to them, listening to the sounds of their family moving through the rooms behind them. And somewhere in the kitchen, William's loaf of bread sat cooling on the counter, better than the one before, ready for tomorrow. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Clara found it on the kitchen table when she came downstairs at 4:30, which meant someone had placed it there, deliberately set it where she would find it first, before the rest of the house was awake. She picked it up. It was addressed to Nathaniel, but had been opened already, and underneath it in Thomas's handwriting on a separate piece of paper was a single line. You should read this before Pa comes down. She stood in the dark kitchen with the lantern, and she read it. It was from a lawyer in Helena, a man named Alderton, representing the estate of a woman named Margaret Forsyth, a name Clara did not recognize. The letter was formal and precise in the way lawyers' letters were, but the meaning underneath the formal language was very clear. Margaret Forsyth had been Nathaniel's mother's younger sister. She had died 6 weeks ago, without children, without a husband, and with a modest property outside Helena that she had left in its entirety to Nathaniel Carter, her only living relation she had ever maintained correspondence with. The property was not large, but it was clear of debt, and there was money attached to the estate, not a fortune, but a number that sitting in Clara's kitchen at 4:30 in the morning made her set the letter down very carefully on the table and press both hands flat beside it and breathe. She heard Thomas on the stairs. He came into the kitchen already dressed, which meant he had not slept, and he looked at her face when he saw her and said, "You read it." "I read it," she said. "I found it yesterday afternoon," he said. "The mail rider left it with Samuel in town. I didn't know when to—" He stopped. He sat down at the table. He put his hands flat on it the same way she had. "I kept thinking about what it means." "What does it mean to you?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "It means the ranch is safe," he said. "Not just from Caldwell, from everything. It means Pa has room to breathe." He paused. "It means Samuel can go." She was quiet. "He can go, and it won't break us," Thomas said. He said it like he had been carrying the weight of Samuel's leaving for a long time, holding it against the fragility of everything else, and now he was setting it down. "He can go, and we'll still be whole." Clara picked up the letter again. She thought about the 60-day extension, and the $11 short, and Joseph's 40 cents, and Henry's $3.60 from drawing birds. She thought about the bay mare, and the Billings cattle run, and William's bread, and the 63 jars. She thought about all the mornings she had come downstairs at 4:30 and started the fire and started working, because the only way through something hard was to be the person who kept starting. She thought none of that was wasted. Every bit of it had mattered. Every bit of it had built something. And what it had built had held them together long enough to reach this morning, this letter, this number on a page. "Wake your father," she said. Thomas looked at her. "Not yet," he said. "Let him sleep another hour. He doesn't sleep enough." She looked at her stepson, 21 years old, tired in a way that went down to the bone, a boy who had been a man since he was 17, and who still even now, even with everything changing, put his father's sleep ahead of his own need to have the conversation. "All right," she said. 1 hour. She made coffee. Thomas sat at the table, and she sat across from him, and they talked, really talked, the way they had never quite managed before, in the quiet of the early morning, with the house still asleep around them. He told her about the years after his mother died, about being 17 and understanding with a clarity that had felt like ice water that his father was not going to be able to hold things together alone, and that someone had to step into the space his mother had left. About making that decision, not because he wanted to, but because there was no other option he could see. "Did you resent it?" she asked. Every day for 2 years, he said. And then I stopped. Why? Because resentment was taking up space I needed for other things, he said. He said it plainly without drama. Pa needed me. The boys needed somebody. Resentment wasn't going to change that. She looked at him. Thomas, she said, you are one of the finest people I have ever known. He looked at the table. I'm just a man who did what needed doing, he said. That is exactly what I said, she told him. I was quiet for a moment. Then, do you think you'll stay for good, I mean? Not, I know you said you would. Do you want to? She held his gaze. I want to, she said. This is my home. These are my people. She paused. You are my people, all of you. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. He nodded once the way he did when he had decided something. Okay. Nathaniel came downstairs an hour later and found them both at the table and the coffee already cold, and Clara heating the pot again, and he looked at the two of them and knew immediately that something had happened. What is it? He said. Thomas slid the letter across the table. Nathaniel sat down. He read it. Clara watched his face. He read it twice. The second time, through something in his expression, began to shift slowly, like ice in a spring thaw, the long-held tension in his jaw beginning to release. He set the letter down. He looked at the window. Margaret, he said, very quiet. You knew her? Clara asked. She wrote to me every Christmas, he said. After my mother died. Every Christmas without fail. A letter and a small package dried fruit, once a tin of hard candy, 1 year a book. He paused. I wrote back, not always as promptly as I should have. His voice was low with something that was not quite guilt, but lived near it. I didn't know she had property. She didn't want to make a fuss about it, I reckon, Thomas said. Nathaniel looked at the number on the page one more time. He put the letter down. He looked at Clara. This changes things, he said. Yes, she said. The mortgage. Cleared and then some, she said. With enough left to repair the barn properly, restock the cattle and have something in reserve. He was quiet. Nathaniel, she said. He looked at her. It's all right to feel it, she said. Whatever you're feeling. He sat at the kitchen table in the early morning light with his hands flat on the wood and his eyes very bright, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. And then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and he just held it, and the kitchen was quiet around them, and that was enough. The boys had to be told. Clara let Nathaniel do it because it was his news and his family, and she stood in the kitchen doorway while he sat them all down in the front room, all 6 of them arranged on chairs and the floor and the arm of the settee, the way they arranged themselves when something important was being said, and he told them about Margaret Forsythe and the letter and the property and the number. The room was very quiet when he finished. Then Joseph said, So we're not going to lose the ranch? No, Nathaniel said. We're not. We were never going to lose the ranch, Joseph said with the absolute confidence of a 9-year-old who had decided this was true, and therefore it was. Clara wasn't going to let us. Nathaniel looked at Clara in the doorway. She looked back at him. No, he said. She wasn't. William said from the arm of the settee where he was sitting with his arms crossed in the old way. What about Samuel? Everyone looked at William. Then everyone looked at Samuel. Samuel had gone very still. What about Samuel? Nathaniel said. William looked at his father directly. He has a map under his mattress, he said. He's been thinking about leaving for 2 years. Everyone knows it, and nobody says it. He paused. Say it. The room held its breath. Samuel looked at his father. Nathaniel looked at his second son for a long moment. I know about the map, he said. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. I've known for a year, Nathaniel said. I wasn't ready to talk about it. He paused. I'm ready now. He looked at Samuel steadily. Where do you want to go? Samuel opened his eyes. Something in his face was raw in a way Clara had not seen before. Not the careful neutrality he usually wore, not the measured observation. Raw. West, he said. Oregon, maybe. There are horse operations out there breeding programs. I've been reading about them." He stopped. "I wasn't going to go without telling you. I want you to know that. I just didn't know how to tell you without it feeling like leaving," Nathaniel said. "Yes," Samuel said. "You are leaving," Nathaniel said. He said it plainly. "That's what growing up is. You leave. You build your own thing." He paused. "I should have told you that a long time ago, instead of letting you carry it like it was something to be ashamed of." Samuel looked at his father. "I'm not ready yet," he said. "I've got another year in me here, maybe more. I want to see the ranch right before I go." "It's going to be right," Nathaniel said. "After today, it's going to be right." "Then I'll go when it is," Samuel said. "And not before." Nathaniel nodded. He looked like a man who had been holding a door shut against something for a long time and had just let it open, and the thing that came through was not what he had feared. It was just his son. His son, who was going to grow up and leave the way sons did the way they were supposed to. "When you go," Nathaniel said, "you go with my blessing. You hear me full and complete." Samuel pressed his lips together. "Yes, sir," he said. Henry from the floor where he was sitting cross-legged said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere." Everyone looked at him. He shrugged. "I just wanted to say it." Joseph said, "I'm not going anywhere either." "You're 9, Thomas said. "I know how old I am," Joseph said. Ethan from the windowsill where he had installed himself at some point during the conversation said, "I'm going to live here forever." And something broke open in the room. Not grief, this time, not the weight of things, but the other thing, the thing that was underneath the grief and had been there the whole time, waiting. And the laughter came again, warm and real and full, and it moved through the family, the way light moved through a room when someone finally opened the curtains. The weeks that followed were the easiest Clara had known since arriving at the Carter Ranch, which did not mean they were without work, or without friction, or without the ordinary daily difficulties of 8 people living together and figuring out how to be a family. It meant something more precise than easy. They were weeks in which the ground was solid under everyone's feet, and when something went wrong, as things always went wrong, there was enough in reserve in the bank and in the household and between the people to handle it without anyone falling. Nathaniel settled the mortgage. He wrote to the bank in person and sat across from the manager with Clara beside him and paid what was owed, and the satisfaction in his face when he walked out of that bank was the kind that came from a man who had been afraid for so long that the absence of fear felt like a new country. He bought Ethan boots. He came home from town and presented them with the complete casualness of a man who had definitely not spent 20 minutes in Garber's General, deciding between 2 pairs, and Ethan put them on immediately and wore them for the rest of the day, including to bed, which Clara only discovered when she went to check on him that night and found him asleep with his boots on, and his face so profoundly satisfied that she did not have the heart to take them off. She told Nathaniel the next morning. He laughed, the real laugh, the one she had heard for the first time at the supper table over William's burned bread, and said, "Let him keep them on, he's earned it." Thomas, freed from the weight of being the sole adult in the room, became something Clara had glimpsed occasionally, but not seen fully. A young man with a dry and precise sense of humor, an opinion about almost everything, and a particular talent for managing the cattle operation that had previously been buried under the sheer necessity of managing everything else. He and Nathaniel began working side by side in a way that looked less like father tolerating son and more like 2 men who respected each other's judgment. It happened gradually. Clara watched it happen. She didn't point it out. William baked bread every other day. He did not make a production of it. He simply did it, came downstairs in the afternoon, got the flour and the starter, worked the dough with the focused intensity he brought to everything, put the loaves in the oven. He had developed opinions about crust temperature and resting time that he expressed to Clara in the kitchen, in the tone of a craftsman discussing his work, and she received these opinions with the seriousness they deserved. And they had long technical conversations about bread that Henry sometimes sat in on because he liked to listen to people talk about things they cared about. Henry drew birds. He had by this point built a small and steady business, if a 12-year-old boy with a charcoal pencil and an extraordinary eye could be said to have a business supplying drawings to 3 households in Red Hollow and one family in the next town over, who had heard about him from somebody who had heard about him from somebody else. Mrs. Garver had commissioned a series of 6 drawings for her parlor wall. Mr. Aldrich had placed a second order. A rancher from outside town, whose name Clara didn't know, had ridden in specifically to ask if the Carter boy could draw his horses. Henry had said he'd try. He had drawn the horses. The rancher had paid him $1.50 and said it was the best likeness he'd ever seen of an animal. Henry had come home and put the money on Clara's kitchen table, and she had pushed it straight back to him. "That is yours," she said. "That is yours absolutely." He had looked at the money. "I don't need it for anything," he said. "Then save it," she said. "Until you do." He picked it up. He looked at her. And Henry, who said less than anyone else in the family and had been the quietest and most careful about letting people in, said, "Thank you, for the birds thing, for asking about them." She looked at her 12-year-old stepson. "Thank you for showing me the hawk," she said. "I meant what I said. Those are the most beautiful drawings I've ever seen." He looked at the floor. He nodded once. He kept the money. It was a Sunday in early autumn. When it happened, the thing Clara would think about later as the moment she understood that the turning was complete, that the family had come through and come out into something solid and lasting and real. They were all at the table, all 8 of them. Sunday supper, which had become by gradual mutual agreement. The meal that everyone made a point of being present for, regardless of what else the week held. The food was good roasted chicken from their own flock potatoes, from the garden bread, from William apple preserves, from Margaret Forsyth's root cellar legacy, now almost gone, and each jar treated accordingly. Nathaniel said grace. He had started doing this a few weeks ago, without announcement, just bowing his head and saying a few words before they ate. The first time he'd done it, the table had gone very still. Now it felt like the meal wasn't fully started until he did. When he lifted his head, he looked around the table. He looked at Thomas, at Samuel, at William and Henry, and Joseph and Ethan. He looked at all of them in turn, slowly like a man taking an inventory of the most important things he owned. Then he looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "I want to say something," he said. The table was quiet. He put his hands flat on the table on either side of his plate. He was not a man who made speeches. The entire table knew that, and gave him the room he needed to find the words. "A year ago," he said, "I wrote a letter." He paused. "I wrote it because I was out of options and I knew it. I wrote it because I was failing this family and I had run out of ways to pretend I wasn't." He paused again. His voice was low and steady. "I asked for someone capable, someone who could help with the boys." He looked at Clara. "What I got was considerably more than I asked for." She held his gaze. "I don't know how to say what this year has been," he said. "I don't have the words for all of it. What I know is that a year ago this table was empty more nights than it was full. This house was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace." He stopped. "It isn't quiet anymore." "I'll say," said Joseph. "Joseph," said Thomas. "He's right," said William, flatly, from his seat by the window. "It isn't quiet anymore." Something shifted at the table. Something warm and slightly undone, and very real. Nathaniel looked at Clara. "You came here because you had to," he said. "And you stayed because you chose to. And everything that this family is right now, everything that it has, is because you chose to stay." He paused. "I am grateful. Every one of these is grateful. And I want you to know that this—" He gestured at the table, at all of them, at the room and the house and everything beyond it. "This is yours. This is your family. This is your home." Clara pressed her lips together. She held herself steady. She thought about the boarding house room in Missouri, the $22.30. The letter she had read until the creases wore through, the stagecoach platform and the gray wagon and the black hat with the silver band. She thought about the first night and the empty shelves and Ethan's bare feet and Joseph's careful question. "You're not going to leave, are you?" And all the 4:30 mornings and the bread in the garden and the 60-day extension and Douglas Caldwell's face when she put the envelope on his desk. She thought about Thomas's hands flat on the table in the early morning, telling her Samuel could go and it wouldn't break them. She thought about holding Nathaniel's hand on the porch under the Montana stars. She looked around the table at her family. At Thomas, who had held everything together until someone came who could hold it with him. At Samuel, who had a map under his mattress and a future ahead of him and a father's blessing to go toward it. At William, who had put a breadbasket in front of her and never mentioned it again, and baked better every week. At Henry, who drew birds in the dirt with a stick and had the most extraordinary eye she had ever seen. At Joseph, who told too many stories and asked the right questions at the right moments. At Ethan, who had carried eggs like treasure and slept in his boots and climbed into her arms in the kitchen and said we kept it like it was the most natural thing in the world. At Nathaniel, who had written a letter when he was out of road and who had sat across from her at this table and been slowly and deliberately and fully found his way back to himself. She looked at all of them. She said, "I didn't come here to save anyone." The table was very still. "I came here because I needed a home," she said. "That's the truth. I came here for myself as much as for any of you." She paused. But somewhere in the middle of all of it, the bread and the beans and the garden and Mr. Caldwell and the 60-day extension and Henry's birds and Joseph's 40 cents and Ethan's boots. She stopped. She took a breath. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped needing a home and started being in one. Nobody spoke. Ethan from his chair reached over and put his hand over hers on the table. He just put it there, small and warm and certain. She turned her hand over and held it. Thomas picked up the breadbasket and passed it to Samuel. Samuel passed it to William. William passed it to Henry. Henry passed it to Joseph. Joseph, with great ceremony, passed it to Ethan, who took a piece and passed it to Clara. She took the bread. She held it. She looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at her with everything he was, and everything he had been, and everything he was still becoming, and he said, "Welcome home, Clara." She had come to Red Hollow, Montana on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1887, with one worn suitcase and $22.30, and a letter she had read until the folds wore through. She had come as a stranger to a broken house and a broken man and 6 boys who had stopped believing anyone stayed. And she had stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, not because she had promised to, but because this was where she belonged, at this table in this house, with these people who had fought for something together and come through it together and built something out of the wreckage of grief and hard luck and sheer stubborn refusal to quit. She belonged here because belonging was not something that happened to you. It was something you chose. Every morning at 4:30. Every loaf of bread, every jar of green beans, and every repaired fence post, and every conversation in a dark kitchen, and every hand held on a porch under the Montana stars. You chose it, day after day after day. Until one day you looked up from the table at the faces of the people who had chosen you back, and you understood that home was never a place you were given. Home was a place you built together out of everything you had with every person willing to stay. And the Carter family had stayed, all of them.